Hello, hello. This is The Art of Plenty. I am Amy McInnes. I am an entrepreneur. I am a couples counselor. I am a mother of 5. I'm also a granddaughter. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk about grief and loss. And I want to share something that can be a light at the end of the tunnel when we're going through grief. I want to share something that you can utilize to pull yourself out of those experiences of loss and grief that we will all experience at some point in our life. I want to talk about my grandmother. She passed away a couple years ago now. And I just have to preface this because I want you to know that I have been incredibly blessed in my life because my grandparents lived through most of my life. My whole childhood, I had all my grandparents, and into my adult life, I had all of my grandparents. Every one of my kids has met my grandmother as well as my grandmother on my other side and one of my husband's grandmas. So they have had the experience of having a great grandmother, which is something I never had, but I was very close with my paternal family growing up, and I still am. And my grandmother was the matriarch of that family. When she passed, it was Christmas Eve. And it wasn't one of those deaths that had tragedy attached to it, or one of those deaths that felt like it wasn't time. My grandma was in her 90s. And she had lived an incredible life, a life that was full of laughter, a life that was full of joy, a life that was full of hope. In those situations, when someone passes, when someone moves on, the grief that we experience is quite different than when the death is tragic or when the death is somebody that's younger. And I recognize that, and I realize that this tip that I'm going to be sharing with you may not have the same degree of relief as it would in a situation like I was experiencing with my loss with my grandmother. We expect our grandparents to pass. We know that that's happening. We don't have that same experience when it comes to talking about the loss of a child or the loss of a close friend or somebody that's young or somebody that's done all the right things and still gets sick and dies. All the right things, meaning makes all the right choices for health, and there doesn't seem to be any reason why this should be happening to them. I bring this forward because not only do I want to acknowledge that the types of grief we experience are different, but that the situations that are causing the grief are different. And depending on those situations and depending on how we experience grief, or what we have going on in our own life, that experience is different. So this tip that I'm going to be sharing with you to work through grief will have varying ranges of effectiveness depending on the situation that you're in. Let me tell you a little bit about my grandmother. As I said, she was the matriarch of our family on my dad's side. She was a woman who grew up with Italian parents. So she was the first person in her family, well, her family, like her siblings, they were the first persons that were born in Canada. So her parents had come over from Italy and France. And, my kids are always asking, well, what's our heritage? And I'm like, well, we're kind of a mixed bag, but we're Canadian. And my grandma was no different, but she was Italian. Now, When you think of Italian, I'm sure a lot of amazing things come to mind, such as food, such as the focus on family. And my grandma was like that in one way and not like that in another. You see, it wasn't until a few years ago that I realized why food wasn't a big part of our Italian family experience. You see, my grandmother, she lost both of her parents when she was a kid. And I can't even imagine what that experience must have been like for them. They were living in a small mining town in BC. It was called Michelle. And their father had passed away, and then their mother was sick. And she died in the hospital. She died from cancer. And because of the age of my grandmother's sister, Betty, and perhaps because of the generation that they were living in, and perhaps because of the number of kids, they didn't ship them off or move them into another home or split them up. They stayed together and they raised themselves. Now, the youngest brother at that time was 5. And I've been asking my aunties, well, how old was grandma when her mom died? And they didn't know offhand, but they're getting me that information. So maybe I can update that in the show notes. But I think my Aunt Betty was around 15, and I think my grandma was around 13, or she might have been 11. So there were 3 girls, and I believe there were 4 boys. That was the family. And because they were so young, the types of cooking that they would have known how to do, the family recipes that would have been passed down, were very limited because they were kids. If I think about the things that I knew how to make as a teenager, as a 13-year-old, or as a 15-year-old, I'm telling you, the only thing I could cook was tacos. And I had to cook a meal every week in our family home growing up. And I mean, I say every week, but I doubt it was every week. But I always made tacos. I am telling you, I know how to brown ground meat. I can do it, and I always have it's all broken up. I am incredible at tacos. But the things that I've learned how to cook, the things that I've learned how to make, the family recipes that are important to me are the ones that I learned as an adult when I had kids and was starting to have kids and starting our family. Those are the recipes that I have learned how to make that my mom passed on to me. And I didn't know those as a kid, even though I cooked and baked with my mom in the kitchen all the time as a child. I did not really retain that information. And even as an adult now, if there's a recipe, I'll phone my mom, hey, how did you do that? Or do you remember this recipe that we used to eat? And she'll send it to me. And we have a lot of recipes that we now make in my family that I had growing up. And they were passed down to me, but only since I've been an adult. When I think about that, it makes sense to me why my grandmother was such a plain cook. My father grew up on potatoes, and perhaps it was the generation too, but we are talking very bland food and very overcooked dry meat. Thanksgiving dinner, everything was white except for the Jell-O. And the Jell-O would have been bright red or bright green. But of course, it had a blob of white whipping cream, which probably came out of a can for dessert. Very plain meals, not what you would expect from a traditional Italian family. And I believe that happened because those recipes never got passed down. My grandma remembered making that her mom would make this sheet pan cake. And on Sundays, they would take it because there would be this potluck that would happen after church, I believe. So she would always make this cake and take this cake. I have been looking for what this recipe would be because my grandma doesn't know. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was try experimenting to see if I could figure out what this cake was and make it for her so she could taste it and see if it was the cake that she remembered from being a little girl. But it's too late. I won't ever know. You see, my grandma was the last one from her family of origin. She was the last one to pass on. And I don't know what that Italian sheet cake was. And I won't be able to give it to her to see if it's like the one that she remembered as a little girl. And I have some loss related to that. I miss my grandma's stories. When I was a kid in school and I would hear about different peoples that had an oral language rather than a written language, it never really registered what that meant to me. And when I think about my grandma now, I have an understanding of what that means, because my grandma was always telling stories, and she would tell us the same stories over and over again, and then we would hear a new story. She would tell the stories of her life. She would tell the stories of her family. And we would hear them. And now I understand what it means to have an oral language, because my grandma's history is oral. And she passed her history down to us through these stories. And I have a few favorite stories that she used to tell me. My grandma's name was Lolly, but that was a nickname. You see, she hit her thumb and it swelled up so bad that it looked like a lollipop. And that's why she got called Lolly. And that was one of the stories she would tell us. And you see, all of my grandmother's siblings had nicknames. And I can't help but wonder if that's because they raised themselves and they raised each other as a group of kids. I think about how my kids interact with their younger siblings. They often use pet names for each other. And I think as they've gotten older, they have moved away from some of those pet names. But we call my youngest daughter everything from Zuzu to Zai. She gets absolutely every nickname under the book. And I think it's because it's an affectionate way when you're talking with children. And I think that's why my grandmother's siblings were all known by their nicknames. My uncles were called things like Popeye and Pee-wee and Tiki and Jackie. And these were the names that they were referred to. I didn't even know that they weren't their real names until later. I don't even know if I know their real names. I don't actually know what Pee-wee's name is. He's always been Pee-wee or Popeye. I know what Jackie's name was, but that's just because it was Jackie, I think. I'm bringing this up because when I think about these stories, when I think about my grandma's oral history and how she shared it with us, it becomes a light for me. It becomes a bit of warmth. Because when I think about the story, I can see her face and I can remember her telling me things. And it makes me smile. And it makes me feel close to my grandma, and it makes me feel connected to my family and to my family line and my history. One of my favorite stories that my grandma would tell me was about when my grandpa walked into a cafe that she was working in, and I don't know who he told, but the way my grandma tells it or told it was that when he walked into the cafe, he looked at her and he said, "That's the woman I'm going to marry." And he did. He married her. And when my grandma would tell that story, she would laugh and she would smile. And when I think about my grandma laughing and smiling, it's like she's here. She's not here, I know that, but I can feel that love and that warmth that I felt when I was with her and in her presence. That's what sharing about your loved ones does. That's what thinking about your loved ones does. And when grief is really new, when grief is recent, it can be really difficult to think about those things because it brings up the hurt. I think part of the reason that this is a light for me is because of the duration that has happened since my grandma's passed. It's been a few years. So when I think about these stories and I talk about this, the grief isn't as raw. Because one of the things that grief takes and that loss takes is time. And it doesn't solve things because they're still not here. I still can't go to my grandma's house and hear the story in person. And I won't ever be able to do that again. So it never goes away because they're still gone. They've still moved on. But the experience of being able to think of them lessens the heartache. And over time, things lessen, especially in a situation where the person has lived a really full life. I can also see in my life where my grandma has influenced my personal values. I am very much a family person. I'm very connected to my family, not just my immediate family, like my children and my husband, but also my family of origin. My sister-in-laws are some of my best friends. And I love to talk to my brothers, and I talk to my mom almost every day. I'm very much connected to my family, and they're very important to me. When I would go to my grandma's house after I had had my kids, she would always say to me, she would grab my hand, and she would look at me and she would laugh a little bit, and she would tell me that what I've done, what I've created by having a big family was the best thing that I could have ever done. That it was going to be a source of joy, and that was the best part of life. That family was the best part of life. And she believed that. She lived her life that way. And she always wanted to have us around, our family around. And I think it was related to losing her parents so early in life that those kids just held on to each other so tight. And they continued to be close through their whole life. I grew up knowing my second cousins. I grew up knowing my grandmother's sisters, my grandmother's sister's kids, and my grandmother's sister's kids. I have second and third cousins, and I know who they are. I know things about their life, and it's because of the values that my grandma had about connection with family. That part of her is still evident in the way that I interact with my cousins and the way that I interact with my aunties and my family, because it was modeled to me as something that was important, and I got to experience that without being told it was important. When I was little, I felt that all the time. I felt what it means to be part of a family. And now I'm constantly working to create that and to maintain that, not just with my kids, but with my siblings, as well as with my cousins and my aunts. I reach out, and when I'm feeling the disappointment about my grandma not being here, I can pull from those things that she did, those things that she inspired, and the things that she lived. And that lessens the grief for me. That lessens the disappointment that she's gone, because I can see her signature still in my life, and I can hear her laughter, and I can remember how she would grab my hand. I have this photo of her and my oldest daughter and I in my kitchen, and it's in a little frame, and it was from the week before she passed, and she's sitting in her chair, because at that age she sat in her chair a lot, and my daughter and I are both on either side of her. And in the bottom of the frame I have a photograph of myself from grade 2, and it's a picture that she had in her house of me. And I'm wearing my favorite blue varsity hoodie over my favorite button-up pink shirt. It was the most bizarre outfit, and I do not know why I loved it. It must have been incredibly comfortable, because wearing a button-up shirt that was pink, that is not something that I ever could have seen myself doing. I don't like buttons, and I never liked the color pink, but I wore that shirt a ton, and I wore that varsity hoodie over top of it a ton, and I would wear my hair inside ponytails. And when I see that photo of myself and I see the photo of me with my grandma and my daughter, it brings me a lot of joy, because I remember how I saw the world when I see that picture of my little smiling face. And when I see the picture of my grandma, I remember the way that my grandma lived her life. And there are things that she did that I'm doing, and there's things that I want to do. I want to tell stories like my grandma told stories. Because there is no record of her life like we have now. There was no social media. There was just the way that she remembered living, and she passed those stories down to us. And I think that's a beautiful way to be, and I want to keep telling her stories to my kids, and I want to keep telling our stories to my kids, because there's something magical that happens when I tell my kids a story about them. They just want to hear it over and over and over again. And I wonder if perhaps my grandma told stories because she wanted to hear stories over and over again, because they brought her joy. I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear part of your oral history. What are the things that have made you you? What kind of strengths are you drawing from in your life? Things that have shaped who you are, that have permeated your whole life. There is a space in YouTube where you can reach out with your comments, because I would love to know a little bit more about you and the things that matter to you. There's also an option in Spotify where you can respond to this question about what are some of the things that have made you you that you are taking with you, whether it comes from a grandparent or a parent or something else significant or someone else significant in your life. I would love to hear your stories. And if you are grieving, I hope that listening to me share about my grandma has provided you with an idea of how you can find some light in a dark time. I hope you feel inspired to think about the things that made that person's life so beautiful, and what it is out of that beauty that you're taking forward into today and into this next month and into this next year, a way that you're maintaining their oral history. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for listening to my heart about my grandma. It was a treat for me to be able to talk to her. My next week's session is also going to be about grief and loss, but I'm going to dive into a little bit more about circles of support and some more tangible ways that you can grieve in such a way that you are mindful of the other people that could be hurting. Because loss is never just our own. When we experience grief and loss, there's other people that are experiencing it. It's what it means to be in relationship. So we're going to dive into that next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. It, as always, is an honor that you would share your time with me today. I would love to hear from you, whether you're listening on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please reach out. Please subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode where we continue our discussion about grief. Thank you.